Hello to all of Tuertscher students. I am Mr. V. If you don't know who I am a U.S. history teacher and government teacher. While I may not have many of you or any of you this year, maybe next year, hopefully when we get to some semblance of a normal school schedule, I'll see quite a few of you in government class. Uh, you have been reading the novel 1984, which is a very dark novel, and it's certainly from a time period that was not exactly the brightest time period in the world's history. So, what we're going to be talking about today is the rise of fascism in Germany. Fascism is an extreme right wing form of government. Anytime you have an extremist form of government, you are going to have violence, you are going to have uh, authoritarian control, you're going to have government involvement. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about the authoritarian regime of somebody like Stalin, who would have been considered left leaning, in the communist regime in the Soviet Union during this exact same time period, or the fascist regimes of either Germany under Hitler or Italy under Mussolini. The same rules and procedures were used by these authoritarian dictators. And in the novel 1984, when they're talking about the government in charge and Big Brother is watching you, and they're utilizing political speak and all the different terminology that Orwell uses within his novel, it's rooted very firmly in both Germany and, for that matter, Russia during this time period in the mid 1940s, early 1950s mentality. So you're talking about the end of World War II when they've seen a tremendous amount of death and destruction, and you're also seeing the early stages of the Cold War where there's just an uneasiness and tension between nations after this great war that occurred. So basically, what I'm going to do today is try and explain how fascism in Germany came into being, what it is, and how somebody like Hitler could actually come to power. So again, we're going to be talking about authoritarian governments coming to power and coming to power, mind you, in a democracy. These folks were elected. They did elect Adolf Hitler, but it's not as simple as a straight up election. It's not like the American system where if we say we want a president, you have two different choices, like we just went through this past week. You have a Democrat, you have a Republican, you have a smattering of small parties. But in this case, we're talking about a prime minister that rose to chancellor because of the coalition style government that they have. I'll explain that as we get into the kind of presentation here. Bottom line is, when we're looking at, and I'll move myself kind of out of the way as best I can. I guess over here works. Um, Germany during World War One, so we're stretching back during World War One when there wasn't a Hitler. Hitler was just a small little foot soldier at that point. He was basically a courier, somebody that took messages between the leadership and the front lines. During World War One, Germany was a little different. Germany was militaristic, but so too were all the other European powers. If you remember from World Studies last year, you remember that many of these countries had imperialist ambitions. You know, the sun never set on the British Empire. France was very large and very powerful during that time period, and Germany, of course, was as well. It was only a matter of time before all of this kind of came into a massive issue. And it all started with a Serbian beginning. If you remember from last year, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was second, kind of next in command, if you will, of the Austria-Hungarian Empire, was murdered in Serbia along with his wife Sophia. He was basically gunned down by an anarchist. Well, the Austrians attacked the Serbians. The Serbians have friends in the Russians. The Russians then attack the Austrians. The Austrians then turn to their friends, the Germans. The Germans attack the Russians. The Russians have an agreement with England and France that if they get attacked by an outside power, that the others will get involved, and before you know it, you have World War One. So, of course, the Central Powers end up becoming, for the most part, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey. The Allied powers, at least at the beginning, were England, France, Russia, a smattering of smaller countries, and eventually the United States later on. Russia, at that point, is not under an authoritarian regime of the Soviet Union. They are not communist yet. That is going to come through a revolution that happens during World War One. But At the time, it was under another authoritarian regime under Tsar Nicholas II. So they went from an authoritarian, right wing, czarist, which is the same as a authoritarian ruler like a king with absolute power, so an absolute monarch, if you will. That's what he was. They went from a extreme right wing government to an extreme left wing government in a communist nature. But again, anytime you go to the extremes, it comes along with a government involvement and a government kind of iron fisted government response, which is what 1984 is really kind of bringing up, is the issue when you have an extremist government, when you have a government that's really involved and checking in on things and making sure that you're following a specific pattern of behavior. So we'll kind of get to that, but again, that's kind of the issue stemming into World War One. You have massive militaries, you have nationalistic fervor, you have imperial ambitions, and then you add in the fact that all these alliances were kind of there, present, but not open and honest. So what should have been a small little regional squabble turned into a world war. Now, the role of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the guy pictured here next to me, is he is the king, if you will, Kaiser of Germany. He is the militaristic leader. He is kind of the galvanizing person, and he's the person that everybody kind of blames for the struggle. Now, on the surface, of course, it's not really his fault. This is not something that he started. This started as a simple conflict between Austria and Serbia, but he gets the bulk of the blame because the Germans look like the aggressors, and they are blamed for most of that. That comes later. Now, as you remember from your world studies last year, trench warfare ended up being exceptionally deadly. It had mass casualty events. These battles were fought for months, if not years, along the same basic battle lines between Germany and France, and massive casualties were on the Eastern Front between the Germans and the Russians as well. Because of these mass casualty events, eventually Russia says we're out, and they fall victim to their own revolution. Now, when Russia ducks out, the Germans and the French basically hold on to fight with the Germans along with the other allies, fighting for quite some time before the United States gets involved in 1917. When we get involved, we bring a new kind of emphasis, a freshness, I guess, if you will, to the struggle. And our addition to the struggle kind of pushes it over the edge, and Germany eventually has to capitulate. The Treaty of Versailles ends up becoming a treaty that punishes Germany by giving them not only massive reparations payments to make, where they have to pay back the Allies and basically apologize for World War I, but they also lose their military, they lose their empire, they lose their Kaiser. The Kaiser is deposed, and they put in place a new government, which eventually becomes what is known as the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was supposed to be a more representative government. It was not supposed to be this militaristic dictatorship. It is now the idea that we are going to create a democracy. The problem is that when they do create this democracy, they don't exactly give proper support to a country that is hurting financially. If anything, they're actually taking money out of the country, which is a problem. So the Weimar is pretty much doomed from the start, because not only are they loaning a tremendous amount of money from nations like the United States, they are, and because of that, they're falling woefully into debt. You have the depression going on during that time period, and nobody is easing off on the reparations payments. So because of all of those factors, you are kind of undermining this republic. They really don't have a chance to recover and become a strong nation because of that. And so, of course, the Treaty of Versailles has a tremendous amount to do with what eventually becomes World War II and the rise of Hitler. Okay, but that's not the only thing here. The other thing is that within the Reichstag is the German government. Okay, this is the German parliament. Within that new Weimar Republic, what they do is they basically have every political party run their slate of candidates. And within Germany, they vote on these political parties within their regions. Now, what they do is they count up the votes for the parties, not for the individuals. And basically, the party ends up getting a certain percentage, whatever percentage they get in the vote. They then send that percentage of their electors, of their representatives, to the Reichstag. So that means there's countless political parties. There's the German nationalists, the communists, the social democrats, which during the 1920s was by far the largest of all of these political parties and most successful ones. There was a small one, a very tough-nosed, gritty one of the rural communities called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis. And they actually, again, came from a rural region of Munich. So they were just outside the city. These were not considered to be city dwellers. This came up in rural Germany. So what do we really know about rural Germany? Well, it's no different than rural any place. It's farmers, it's people that maybe are not as educated. They are very simple in their mentality and in their belief structure. And all they know is that the economy is not strong, the country is no longer strong, and they are frustrated. So it's not surprising that the leader of the Nazi party is able to speak to these people and get them riled up and eventually start to gain support. Now, when we talk about somebody like Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, they are extremists from the start. These are people that are very extreme with their political beliefs, very extreme with their economic beliefs. They don't believe that the current government structure is doing a very good job. They really hate the Treaty of Versailles. They don't like the way World War I ended up. So it's not surprising that these extremists or radicals end up having a failed, what is known as a push or a rebellion, a revolution, if you will. They try to overthrow the local government within Munich. They start within a beer hall, better known as a Hofbrauhaus. So if you've ever been down to the Hofbrauhaus down in Newport on the Levee in Kentucky, it's the same basic company. It's part of the same family of beer halls, believe it or not. The actual Hofbrauhaus over in Germany looks very similar to the one down in Frankfurt, not Frankfurt, in Newport. It's way bigger, by the way, though. If you ever go to Munich and you go to the Hofbrauhaus, you can see how big this place is, and you can have a meal and a beer at a place that Adolf Hitler would have hung out and gave speeches at and had huge meetings. The meeting in Germany most likely is at the bar, so not surprisingly, the Nazis used to hold their political rallies there. They started their overthrow attempt of the government in 1923. It did not work. And the Weimar Republic basically kind of gave him a pass. What normally would be considered treason, and normally you'd be lined up against a wall and shot or hanged, they instead took it easy on him. They sent him to jail because they didn't want to make him a martyr. And if you remember, a martyr is somebody that dies for a cause. So they didn't want to do that. They felt like this is just some radical, crazy guy that if they put him in jail for a little while, the Workers' Party will fall apart and you'll never hear from him again. Now, instead, Hitler goes to jail and starts working on the final touches of what becomes known as Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. That is his autobiography. If you read Mein Kampf, it makes it very clear what his plan is. And as a German socialist, is what he calls himself. In reality, he is a fascist, and a fascist is somebody that believes that the state comes before the individual, that you do everything for the country first. So country first. We do everything for the country, for the good of the country, and for the good of every, it's a very nationalistic mentality. Very borderline what is known as jingoism, where your foreign policy and your military policies are so wrapped up in the fatherland, waving the German flag. You're so ingrained in it that you kind of forget everything else, including reason. These people are, these are the people that are waving the banner so loudly that they're not even listening. They're not, can't hear you over the flag. These are the types of people we're talking about. And so Hitler really kind of plays up these people. Now, when Hitler is released, he goes back and tries to play the game. He realizes, I can't overthrow the government, so I should get involved in the government. And I should then kind of play the game and try and get power within that structure. Well, the structure was led by a guy named Hindenburg. Hindenburg was a World War I general. He was somebody that was a war hero. And basically, Paul Hindenburg was the national hero. He was somebody that all Germans, regardless of what they felt, they looked to Hindenburg and said, that's our guy. So think of Hindenburg almost kind of like as a Washington type figure, George Washington, that no matter who you are, you kind of look back and say, well, Washington's very venerated in American history. Hindenburg was kind of like that. The problem was is that Hindenburg in the late 1920s was in his 80s, so he was very old. He was somewhat crotchety, and he really didn't want to deal with any of this crazy stuff. He didn't want to deal with. He viewed Hitler as an embarrassment. He called him a little foot soldier. He didn't view him as an equal by any stretch. So as Hitler started to gain political clout and power throughout the early 1930s, Hindenburg did not understand how. He could not comprehend, and he dismissed it. He thought, oh, well, the people are going to figure out how full of crap he is. He's just this little annoyance. He didn't see that Hitler was backed up by a growing amount of basically ticked off people that were so mad at the system. Now, why were they mad? Because myths had existed for a very long time, and Hitler played up those myths. The stab in the back theory was the idea that the German army was stabbed in the back by the politicians, that the German army was going to win World War I if it wasn't for these politicians who basically declared peace and signed the Treaty of Versailles and basically gave away German nationalism. This is, of course, ridiculous. The German army had been defeated. There wasn't really any chance of them winning the war. The stab in the back theory was complete nonsense, but the German people believed it. And this is the problem. When people are so angry and so frustrated, and you see a little bit of this in America right now with COVID and with the economy maybe struggling here and there and people being frustrated, and you go online, how many conspiracy theories can you find online? Whether it be QAnon, whether it be, any sort of posting on social media where somebody's, oh, well, I know the real truth. I know what's really happening. Don't listen to the fake news. I know what's really happening. Well, that was happening in Germany as well during this time period, that people were reading articles. And even though these authors and these journalists were being absolutely truthful about what was happening, people would read it and disbelieve it. This is when people are so angry and upset up here, they start thinking with their gut. And no offense, thinking with your gut means you're pretty stupid, because what does your stomach tell you to do? Eat. It tells you when you're nervous. It tells you when you're upset. It tells you when you're hungry. This is not, the part of the body you're supposed to be using is your head. People were not doing that. And so, of course, the stab in the back theory appeals to people that facts don't matter to them. It's what they think it is. So these are the people that would say, well, I see that, but my opinion is this. Well, that doesn't mean it's fact. And so they're ignoring it. And this is what history teaches us, that whenever somebody says, well, I mean, I don't understand that, but I know this to be true because I feel it, you should immediately discount that person, because feeling it and knowing it are completely different things. So again, being emotional doesn't help. The Treaty of Versailles leading to all post-war issues, that was not the case. There's plenty of blame to go around. There's plenty of issues, plenty of problems. The Germans were being more accepted by the European community. The reparations payments had been renegotiated in the past. It's not like the Treaty of Versailles was completely decimating the German Republic. They could have worked together to kind of pull themselves out of it. The Jewish people were to blame. Complete myth as well. The problem is after World War One, and Poland forms because of the end of World War One, a lot of Jewish people who were in Russia, in Poland, in Eastern European countries saw the writing on the wall that they were not going to be welcome in those countries. So they ran to Germany. So because of this massive influx of Jewish populations, what happens when people massive come into this country? We see it now when people come into the United States. How many times do you hear some people screaming, build the wall? Whether or not you agree with that, what is the primary purpose of build the wall? There are people coming into the country that you don't know, don't like, don't understand, don't want, whatever the case may be. So the idea is we've got to keep them out. Well, the Germans felt the exact same way about these Jewish people coming into the country. There was already a feeling, a anti-Semitism as it's known, a hatred of the Jewish people. There was already that kind of already within the German society. When more people come in who maybe don't speak the German language or don't adapt to the German culture as quickly, that's going to spark even more hatred and misunderstanding. And so that's already embedded within there. And the myth is that, oh, the Jewish people are the people that kind of somehow hindered the war effort. That was not true, but people believed it. And then finally, the Russian Revolution was hated in Germany. That's kind of a myth as well. There are people in Germany who are registered communists during the 1920s who want to see that change as well. And because of that, there's this perception that there's always going to be somebody overthrowing and fundamentally changing the German Republic. So there is a rise in nationalism of it's us against them, it's us against the Jews, it's us against the communists, it's us against the outsiders, whatever the case may be. So this is ripe for somebody like Hitler to come to power, who's going to put Germany first. So not surprisingly, what ends up happening is the German Socialist Party, the German National Workers' Party, the Nazis, were able to get a fair amount of the electorate in the 1932 Reichstag elections. Now, when they did that, Hitler was able to form a coalition government with nationalists to create an over 50% majority and elevate him into the upper echelons of the German Republic. Now, he wasn't as high as Hindenburg, but he was there. He was, he either was going to be the vice chancellor or he was going to be the chancellor. And the Nazis started a petition to be more involved. One of the things that they did to try and quell this was they offered Hitler's second in command, a guy named Hermann Goering, not only the leadership within the parliament, the Reichstag, but they also kind of allowed him to lead the police force in Prussia, which is the largest province of Germany. That is the group that eventually became the Gestapo, the secret police. Hermann Goering is a pretty nasty individual, and we'll talk about him in a bit. But when the German police, secret police, are taken over by the Nazis, they start turning them into their own private army, if you will. And this army was not interested in going out and killing French or Polish or Russian people. They are turning inside and getting rid of political prisoners. In 1934, the Night of the Long Knives was this kind of consolidation of power. They're solidifying their power and their political base by getting rid of enemies. Now, some of them were shot and killed. Some of them were, sitting at a desk. One of the former prime ministers is sitting at his desk, kind of writing out some things. His wife is sitting there listening to the radio, and a group of Nazis come charging in and shoot them both, killing them both in their home. Nobody ever went to prison. Nobody was held accountable. This is what happened. They basically took the law into their own hands, and there was no police force that really was going to police them. This sent a clear message that the Nazis had not only won election, but they were now taking over control. This is also the beginning of the concentration camps. Hitler had convinced people by that point that they needed to get rid of dangerous mentalities and dangerous ideologies. He cited the idea that there were Russian influences, that the communists were taking over. And he played up that fear of that outsider again, sometimes with Jews, to kind of point this idea that there is an outsider who is an enemy to the Republic. This is basic fascist ideology, that the government is your most important thing, and anybody that gets in the way of that government needs to be eliminated. So that's where the concentration camps come. Now, I want to make a distinction. The concentration camps were not the extermination camps. This is not the Treblinkas, the Auschwitz. That comes later during what is known as the final solution. Concentration camps are the idea that we're going to put you into places like Dachau and Oranienburg, which is outside of Berlin, and they're going to work you to death. They're going to make you work so long that you're just going to give out. You're not going to eat properly. You're not going to get enough rest. You're going to die of disease. You're going to die of starvation. You're going to die of exhaustion, whatever the case may be. But that's what they're doing. They're getting rid of political prisoners, people that are communists, people that are homosexual, people that are somehow disabled in some way or mentally unbalanced. They're going to get rid of anybody that doesn't fit into a narrative of what the German people should be like and what they should do. Kristallnacht is the next level of that, and it's really the first step of what eventually becomes the final solution of the Jewish question. They had started off with exclusion laws where they had basically told Jews that they couldn't own businesses, or the Jews couldn't sit on park benches, or they had to walk in the gutter. It was anything that slowly kind of took away their humanity. This year in U.S. history, you'll be talking about Jim Crow laws. Many of you have already started that because you've talked about things like Plessy versus Ferguson, which was basically saying that Jim Crow laws were okay as long as they were separate but equal. And now we know that that is not actually the case, but that is what they basically did to make African Americans lesser human beings. They're no longer slaves. The fear in the South was that blacks and whites were somehow going to be equal, so they put in laws to make sure that that didn't happen. Well, that's what they're doing in Germany here with these laws to make sure that here are the German people, the Jewish people are here, but now we're going to put them down here. And that's kind of what this basically was. Kristallnacht ends up being what is known as the Night of Broken Glass, where there is a pogrom. It's an attack against a Jewish community. This is where the Nazis, along with their followers, go into Jewish communities all throughout Germany and basically break the windows of Jewish-owned businesses, light them on fire, attack houses of prominent Jewish leaders, attack synagogues, and Jewish people are killed in the streets. Nobody's held accountable. It just doesn't happen. Now, what are the Nazis doing at that point? They're seeing, is there going to be any resistance? Now that we've done this, is anybody going to stand up and speak out? And this is where the German people get blamed. It's not that they were all Nazis. In fact, right before World War II starts, only about 20% of the German people classified themselves as a Nazi. The other 80% could have risen up against the Nazis. They didn't do it. So because of that, they're all held accountable for the rise of Hitler. This is our classic lesson within history that if you don't speak out, if you don't step up, if you don't stand against that type of oppression, you are guilty of it as well. Silence means acceptance. So again, that's kind of the beginnings of what eventually again becomes known as the final solution. Now, the main core of guys, and there's way more German leaders, but the core guys that I'm going to talk about here are the people pictured here in Adolf Hitler, who's extreme to the left, Hermann Goering, who's in the center there, Joseph Goebbels, who's kind of the nerdy guy right in the middle, and a guy named Heinrich Himmler, who is not pictured in this picture unless... no, I don't think he's in this one. Himmler looks even more kind of nerdy than Goebbels. What made this, and what the reason I'm bringing this up is the German leadership started preaching this idea of German nationalism, Germans, and they used symbols. They used red and black flags because that was, red and black along with yellow is, considered the German Republic. That's their color scheme, if you will. They use the swastika because it's a symbol of continuity. They use all this symbology to play up the German Republic, their version of it, their Third Reich. And Reich means basically empire, the Third Republic, the Third Empire of the German state. They said the first one was under Charlemagne, the second one was under Otto von Bismarck, and the third one will be under Hitler. Well, Hitler basically rises to be the chancellor, to be the leader of Germany, and he basically turns over to Goering the leadership of the government, and then part of it, the Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force. And so when World War II starts, Goering is in charge of all of that. Himmler is in charge of how to clean out the country of these political prisoners. So how do you get rid of the Jews? How do you get rid of any of the groups that are basically taken care of in the Holocaust? Himmler is the architect for the whole thing. So when we talk about the Holocaust, yes, Hitler gets blamed for it. Himmler's the one that actually carried it out. Goebbels is the one that explains it. He's the propaganda minister. Now, Goebbels is the kind of person that George Orwell would have found fascinating. Goebbels is this nerdy guy who figures out a way to take whatever Hitler says and spin it to where you're misunderstanding him. He's not a nasty person. He's not racist. He's not this. You're just misunderstanding. He'd explain away everything that Hitler was doing to try and make it to where people would believe it. They would believe the ridiculousness. They would believe the irrational. Goebbels was a master manipulator when it came to his propaganda machine. He's the one that normalized this behavior within Germany. He's the one that was the architect for framing the mindset. Now, Orwell would read that and say, and be influenced to come up with Big Brother is watching you, that you do everything for the state and the state is depending upon you to do the right things, to turn in your neighbors if they're doing the wrong things, to turn in your coworkers if they're not, working to improve the state, to make the state better. That's kind of what the Nazis are doing. That they are basically taking irrational thought and playing up on it to where you do everything for the German Republic, for the Third Reich, for your Führer, which is Adolf Hitler, and that's it. Like that's what you do. So that's kind of the mindset. Now, how do these people gain this? Again, it's the idea that over time, it's not like Hitler took over in a coup and the next day he was like, all right, we're killing a bunch of Jews and we're taking care of this. He took power in 1932-33. They didn't open up the first concentration camp till 1935. And at the beginning, it was just basically a camp for people that were political prisoners. But again, why were they able to do that? Because nobody said, hey, why are we doing this? We need to shut this down. So they went a little farther. And then when nobody said anything, they went a little farther. He hosted the Olympic Games, invited all the people in from around the globe. Jesse Owens goes and dusts all the white guys. And keep in mind, this is a group of people that have proclaimed the Aryan race, that the master race, blonde hair, blue eyes, white, from the Alpine regions of Germany. Now, how ridiculous is that notion? Look at Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels in the picture. None of them are skinny, Adonis, muscular-looking guys with blonde hair and blue eyes. Goebbels looks like the guy that you beat up in, 7th grade gym class. Not that you should do that, but that's what he kind of looks like. He's just kind of this nerdy little guy that obviously had issues. Goering is a fat man. He's just a blob. And, he drinks and eats way too much. He's not anywhere muscular, but he yells a bunch. He gets angry and gets red-faced, and that's it. Not exactly the master race. And Hitler's just, he doesn't fit the description at all. So for them to say we are promoting the master race, wouldn't you think somebody would have said, but none of you look the part? How? But again, it's this irrational idea. And Hitler even says, well, I'm not the master race. No, I'm not, but I'm paving the way to reestablish them. And so it gave hope to other people that, oh, well, if I work hard enough and I rise up through the ranks, that I could take over Germany and lead them to the golden age of whatever. A rational thought, when played up correctly with the right amount of propaganda and the right amount of fixing, the international community came and participated in those Olympic Games. Jesse Owens proved that a black man could go into Germany, totally dust the white boys, and everything, that Hitler was proclaiming was proven to be false. Well, what did Goebbels do? He spun it and said, well, the Americans just had a better time of it. And obviously the Germans weren't working hard enough to prove that they are the master race. So then it became doubled down effort that now we're going to train even harder. And now we got to prove ourselves on the international stage. So instead of turning around where the German people were like, wait a minute, you're proclaiming that we're all going to be the master race, but yet we just got dusted. They believe the nonsense mentality of we got to work harder as a German people to rise up. Again, these guys are master manipulators. They're very good at what they do. It's terrible what they're doing, but they're very good. And that's what fascinates a writer like Orwell. How do you get people subjugated by their own thoughts? And that's what 1984 is all about. What is the prison? Is it society? Is it the government taking over and, placing you in a certain area? Or is it your mind? Are you a prisoner of your mind? That's what these German leaders did to create a society that would cause not only World War II, but one of the largest human rights violations in world history, and certainly one of the largest genocides. They even had to create the word genocide to describe it, that they killed massive amounts of human beings who were not combatants, but their only crime was being a certain religion, a certain political belief, or a certain mentality. Again, that's kind of the whole point of this, is that the fascist governments, the extremist governments, use their authority against their own people to subjugate, to manipulate, and to control. That's what 1984 is all about. That's where this comes from. Again, I didn't mean to go on and on and on, but that's kind of the basis of this. If you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to me through email. You can let Tuertscher know, and I can share a little bit more. But again, that's kind of the basis for why all this happened. Have a good day. Hopefully, you're staying safe and healthy.